Let's begin with summarizing Ford's concept of flow, because it is on these four concepts that Taiichi Ohno decided to build the Toyota production system. Number one, the purpose of operations is to increase flow, or equivalently reducing the lead time. Number two, there should be an installed mechanism to stop overproduction. Number three, abolish measuring local efficiencies. And number four, you should have a focusing mechanism to balance flow. These are the four concepts which Henry Ford used so successfully that his production line concept got worldwide acceptance. Taiichi Ohno also implemented the concepts of flow and systematically went about creating many sub-methods or focusing steps which constantly worked on to make sure that the hindrance to flow was removed. Let us see what Taiichi Ohno did, and if all that he did also followed these four flow concepts. Like Ford, Taiichi Ohno took it on him to make flow his prime driving force. And this is what Toyota production system is built around. Whenever Ohno was asked what was Toyota trying to do while developing its production system, or what was the main aim of the Toyota production system, he said this: all we are trying to do is to look at the moment from when a customer places an order on us and the timeline when we collect the cash from him. And we are always working to reduce this time. This is good enough to prove that all Ohno's system was trying to do was to reduce the lead time of production, which is nothing but to increase the flow through the system. The concept of flow that Ohno learned had to be implemented in a new environment. Flow lines were very successfully implemented where the investment justified by high volumes made dedicated lines possible. However, what Taiichi Ohno was toying with was to use a line, flow line concept, where the equipments were not dedicated, and further to that, the equipments produced many components. In trying to implement flow lines at Toyota, Ohno was faced with an insurmountable task of trying to develop flow when the lines were not dedicated. Dedicated lines were possible if the volumes were very high, and flow lines justified heavy equipment investment because the volumes were high. Toyota did not face this environment. So Taiichi Ohno was toying with the idea of using lines when the equipments were not dedicated and there were multiple components being produced by the same equipment. This was a big task, because to make various models in small quantities, to time all the material to arrive at the assembly line at the time required was not easy. What Ford faced or other assembly lines were doing was they produced low variety and high volume. That means because of heavily standardized parts, one line produced one model. That would mean that the assembly line or the assembly spot did not wait for all the components to arrive simultaneously. Let me explain what I mean. You have the assembly line producing one model. Now suppose on the same assembly line you want to produce multiple models. That means the material required for all the models should be present for it to be assembled. Now if there was only one model, you would have one box with its components with particular nuts and bolts being provided, and whenever this went down, the component was produced. However, now you need to put at least 2 to 3 boxes, because 3 different models will be assembled on the assembly line. And if one of the type went down, the component manufacturing would have to stop and manufacture the one which was consumed. This, since there was a setup change required and too many models to shuffle, by nature it would happen that at the assembly point a lot of components would be waiting. And added to this, if we knew we are going to make 5 of each model, the quantities would also be more. This is what we mean, that when you are faced with multiple models and low volume, there is going to be a lot of inventory waiting at a particular point. And for this example, the assembly point. Now this is a task which had to be abolished while using the assembly line concept, or rather flow line concept. Ono realized that this new concept which the supermarkets were using could be used to solve the problem that he was facing in his factory. Let's understand what is the supermarket concept that they were using. In supermarkets, there was an allocated shelf space where a client came and picked up what he wanted. And when the stock on this shelf went down, the person ran to the back store and from there got the item to replenish. Now even at the back store, there was an allocated space where the stock was kept, and this space was also not very huge, but was also given enough so that only a certain amount of stock could be maintained backstage. Why this came to his vision, or why this came to his understanding, was in supermarket a huge variety was present, but all these items were not jamming the aisles. The biggest learning point here was that only when an item was required on the shelf was it replenished. Now, how do you know that the item was required on the shelf? It was required on the shelf because the space allocated on the shelf had a vacant spot. Now, if the shelf accommodated 5 numbers of an item X and you see only 3 remaining there, what would you replenish? 5 or 2? Naturally 2. That means the quantity to be replenished was decided by the consumption made. And if you got to know that you had sold 2 of that particular item, you send an order to the back store, please replenish 2. It was not that the replenishment people went to the stores, found something lying there, carried it to the shelf and plonked it there. No. Only when the item was taken off the shelf was it replenished. This was the idea which said that if implemented on the shop floor of Toyota production system, I can make sure that though my equipments are not dedicated, I can still produce all the items that I want while keeping the flow intact. The biggest hindrance to flow was log jam because of presence of excess inventory. The excess inventory in Ford system was limited by not providing enough space. But what Taiichi Ohno did was, he moved the whole fundamental of overproduction from the concept of space to inventory. He said that you will not produce more than what is required, and this requirement would be decided by what has been consumed. So by moving the concept of controlling the mechanism of overproduction from space to inventory, Taiichi Ohno expanded the horizon of Ford's concept of flow to a new level. And this was the change that we referred earlier, that it made the world think of inventory as a liability rather than asset. The first concept of flow was the driving force. Let me recap. The purpose of an operations is to increase the flow of product or material through a system. This is the driving philosophy. However, the second part of the concepts of flow was how to limit overproduction. Ford limited this overproduction by making sure that there's not enough space to pile up. Taiichi Ohno, after moving the concept of control from space to inventory, made the world realize that inventory is a liability. Let us go back and visit the concepts of flow again. The second concept of flow says that there has to be a practical mechanism to limit overproduction. Taiichi was able to develop this Kanban system to limit overproduction. What Kanban actually did was to make sure that only a certain amount of inventory of a particular component was allowed to be present between two stations. This is the second of the 4 concepts of flow that Ford had developed. Now, Kanban system is a fairly simple system. Now, let me explain what is Kanban system.